For 9 years, Robert had left his parents' house untouched, a perfect shrine to the life that ended the day they vanished from a Florida resort. The official story was a tragic accident, a couple lost to the sea. But as Robert finally cleared out the dusty attic to sell the home, his gloved fingers closed around a moldy photo album, the very one they took on that final trip. He expected to find happy memories. Instead, he found a single, terrifying photo that proved their disappearance was no accident at all. What do you think he found in that album, and would you have the courage to investigate a family tragedy after so long? Stick with us as we uncover the truth hidden in the dust and shadows of a forgotten home. The air in the house was thick and still, smelling of dust and faded memories. For Robert, who was now 27, stepping inside was like walking into a photograph from 1994. In the living room, a 9-year-old layer of dust covered the family photos on the mantelpiece. His father, James, with his easy smile. His mother, Patricia, her arm looped through her husband's. They were frozen in time, forever 38 and 36. Robert had been 18 when they disappeared, just graduated from high school and about to leave for college. He'd left, but he never really moved on. His aunt had managed the property, paying the bills from a small trust his parents had left, but she never touched a thing inside. It was Robert's to deal with, and he hadn't been ready until now. The real estate agent, a kind but firm woman named Susan, had been clear. The market is good, Robert, but we can't list it like this. You have to clear it out. People want to imagine their own lives here, not walk into someone else's. Her words were the final push he needed. For weeks, he'd packed up the main floor, boxing up dishes that hadn't been used in a decade and clothes that would never be worn again. But he'd been avoiding the attic. That was where the real history was stored, the Christmas decorations, the old toys, the boxes of things deemed too precious to throw away but not important enough for daily life. He pulled the cord, and the folding stairs creaked down from the ceiling with a groan. A wave of hot, stagnant air washed over him. He pulled on a pair of thick work gloves, put on a dust mask, and climbed into the suffocating darkness, armed with a single flashlight. The attic was an obstacle course of wooden beams and forgotten treasures. Cardboard boxes, softened by years of humidity, were stacked precariously. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating thick cobwebs and the yellowed, fluffy texture of insulation. It was in the farthest corner, tucked under the eaves and behind a box of his old high school yearbooks, that he found it. A larger box sealed with brittle yellowed tape, with Florida 94 scrawled on the side in his mother's neat handwriting. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what was inside. Photos, souvenirs, the physical remnants of their last days. He carried the box down the rickety stairs and set it on the dining room table, the only clear surface in the house. He slit the tape with a pocket knife and lifted the flaps. On top lay a seashell-decorated picture frame and a couple of touristy T-shirts still folded. Beneath them was the photo album. It was a handsome, leather-bound book, but the Florida humidity had not been kind to it. The cover was warped, and patches of greenish-white mold dotted the surface. It looked exactly like the one his mother had been writing in by the pool in so many of his memories. He sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. The first few pages were exactly as he'd imagined. His parents, squinting happily in the bright sun. Pictures of them on the beach, building a clumsy sandcastle. A photo of his dad posing proudly with a ridiculously small fish he'd caught on a charter boat. Robert felt a familiar ache in his chest, a mix of love and profound loss. He slowly turned the pages, soaking in these last images of his parents being themselves, carefree, in love, and alive. He was almost at the end when he noticed something was off. The last clear plastic sleeve, meant to hold the final photo of the trip, was empty. But it wasn't just empty, it felt thicker than the others. He carefully pried the sleeve open and realized a photograph had been slipped in behind the white cardboard backing. It was a strange place to hide a picture. With his gloved fingers, he carefully worked it out. The photo was dark, clearly taken at night. It showed the resort's outdoor tiki bar, its thatched roof barely visible against the dark sky. His parents weren't in the picture. The only person was a man behind the bar, wiping it down with a rag. He had a weathered, tired face and a distinctive tattoo of a coiled snake on his forearm. He was looking directly at the camera, his expression unreadable, almost challenging. Robert frowned. Why would his father, an amateur photographer at best, waste a shot on a random bartender? He almost dismissed it, ready to put the photo back, when he felt something else in the sleeve, a small, folded piece of paper. It was a piece of the resort's official stationery. He unfolded it carefully. The note was short, written in his father's hurried script. Paul, The deal is set. Dock B, 11 p.m. Don't be late. Robert read the words again. And again. Paul. The deal is set. Dock B, a cold dread washed over him, extinguishing the warm nostalgia he'd felt just moments before. The police report had been simple and tragic. James and Patricia Whitaker had gone for a late-night walk along the beach on their last night of vacation. Their room key and wallets were found in their hotel room. The authorities theorized they were caught by a sudden, rogue wave, their bodies swept out into the Gulf of Mexico, never to be seen again. An accident. A terrible, heartbreaking accident. But this note, this hidden photo. They didn't speak of an accident. They spoke of a secret meeting, a deal, and a man with a snake tattoo. For the first time in 9 years, a flicker of something other than grief ignited within Robert. It was hope, but it was a terrifying kind of hope, because it meant the story he had forced himself to accept was a lie. He now had a new mission. Find the man named Paul. His investigation started the next day with a long drive south to the resort, or what was left of it. The Sun and Sand getaway of 1994 was now the Ocean Pearl Grand, a sleek, modern complex of glass and steel. The charming, slightly kitschy tiki bar was gone, replaced by a chic lounge with infinity pools. Robert felt a pang of disappointment. An entire world had been paved over. He went to the front desk, the photo clutched in his hand. He tried to act casual, explaining that he was trying to track down an old family friend who used to work there. The young concierge looked at the photo with polite disinterest. "I'm sorry, sir. I've only been here for 2 years. I don't recognize him." It was the same story with every employee he asked. He eventually asked to speak with the general manager, a man named Mr. Davies, who had been with the company for 15 years. Davies looked at the photo and shook his head. The resort was completely gutted and rebranded in '98. Almost all the old staff were let go. We don't have employee records from that far back. Privacy policies, you understand. Robert's heart sank. A dead end. As he was about to leave, he decided to try one last thing. "My parents stayed here in June of 1994, he said, his voice quiet. "James and Patricia Whitaker, they disappeared from here." Mr. Davies' professional demeanor softened. He remembered the story. It was a local tragedy, a dark spot in the resort's history. "I'm so sorry," he said, his tone now genuinely sympathetic. "That must have been awful for you." Seeing the man's change in attitude, Robert pushed a little harder. "That man in the photo," he said, tapping the picture. "I think he might have been one of the last people to see them. I just want to know what happened. Anything you can do would mean the world to me." Mr. Davies hesitated, looking from Robert's pleading face to the photo. He sighed. "Let me make a call. There's a woman, Maria, who was the head of housekeeping for 30 years. She retired a few years back, but she knows everyone who ever worked here. No promises." An hour later, Robert was sitting in a small, neat living room a few miles from the resort, the scent of coffee in the air. Maria, a warm woman with kind eyes, held the photo in her hands. She stared at it for a long time before nodding slowly. "Oh, yes, I remember him," she said. "His name is Paul Miller. He wasn't just a bartender. He worked groundskeeping mostly, filled in at the bar when they were short-staffed, a quiet man, kept to himself." She looked up at Robert. "He got fired, you know, about a week after your parents went missing. Something about him getting into a fight with another staff member. He was trouble, that one." Maria gave him a last known address for Paul, an apartment complex on the other side of town. Hope surged through Robert. It was a real lead. The apartment complex was in a rundown neighborhood, a world away from the luxury of the Ocean Pearl Grand. Paint was peeling from the walls, and the air was heavy with the smell of salt and decay. Robert found the unit and knocked. There was no answer. He spoke to a neighbor, an elderly man watering a sad-looking plant on his balcony. The man remembered Paul. "Oh, yeah, the quiet guy with the tattoo. Haven't seen him in years. Maybe 6 or 7 years ago, he just packed up and left. Said he got a job working on the fishing boats up the coast out of Port St. Joe." The trail was getting colder, but it wasn't dead yet. Robert thanked the man and walked back to his car, his mind racing. He was no detective. He was just a son chasing a ghost. But for the first time, he felt like that ghost was almost within reach. He got in his car and pointed it north, toward Port St. Joe, toward a man named Paul, and the truth he might be hiding. The drive to Port St. Joe took several hours, time Robert spent wrestling with the possibilities. What if Paul knew nothing? What if this was all a wild goose chase based on a meaningless photo? Or worse, what if Paul was directly involved in his parents' disappearance? The thought sent a chill down his spine despite the humid Florida air. He arrived at the marina as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the dozens of fishing boats bobbing in the water. The place smelled of salt, diesel, and fish. Robert started where he always did, by showing the photo. He walked along the docks, asking grizzled fishermen and young deckhands if they knew a man named Paul Miller, a man with a snake tattoo. He got a lot of head shakes and indifferent shrugs. Finally, an older man running a bait and tackle shop squinted at the photo. "Looks a little like Paulie," he grunted. "Used to work on the Sea Serpent a few years back. Not sure if he's still on it. That boat's docked at the far end, Pier C." Robert's pulse quickened. He thanked the man and hurried toward Pier C. The Sea Serpent was an old, rust-streaked trawler that had seen better days. A man was on the deck, mending a large green fishing net, his back to the dock. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, but the build was right. As the man shifted his weight, Robert saw it, a faded but unmistakable tattoo of a coiled snake on his forearm. It was him. Robert's mouth went dry. He walked to the edge of the pier, his footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. "Paul?" he called out, his voice sounding steadier than he felt. The man stopped his work and slowly turned around. His face was deeply lined by the sun and sea, but the eyes were the same as in the photograph, weary and guarded. "Who's asking?" he said, his voice raspy. Robert held up the small photograph. "My name is Robert Whitaker. I think you knew my parents, James and Patricia. You worked at a resort in Clearwater back in '94. Paul's face went rigid. The flicker of recognition in his eyes was instantly replaced by a wall of hostility. "Never heard of him," he muttered, turning back to his net. "You got the wrong guy." "No, I don't," Robert said, stepping closer to the boat. "I found this picture, and I found a note. It was about a deal at Dock B at 11 p.m. Paul froze, his hand stilling on the net. He didn't turn around. The silence stretched on, broken only by the cry of a nearby gull and the gentle lapping of water against the hull. Finally, Paul dropped the net and turned to face him fully, his expression a mixture of anger and resignation. "You shouldn't have come here, kid," he said, his voice low. "Some things are better left buried." Paul sighed, a long, weary sound, and gestured with his head toward a grimy picnic table at the end of the pier. "Sit down," he said. "This isn't a story to be told standing up." Robert followed him, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Paul sat heavily on the bench, running a hand over his tired face. "Your old man," he began, not looking at Robert. "He wasn't supposed to be there. I had a little business on the side. Nothing major. Bringing in some high-end cigars, expensive liquor from the islands, avoiding the taxes. The resort dock was a perfect quiet spot for a handoff." He finally looked at Robert, his eyes filled with a strange kind of pity. "Your dad, he saw me. Saw the whole exchange from his balcony. I thought he was going to call the cops. I was finished." Paul leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "So I went to see him the next day. I was ready to beg, offer him a little cash to keep his mouth shut. But he surprised me. He wasn't interested in turning me in." Paul paused, shaking his head as if still in disbelief. "He told me he was in some deep financial trouble. Bad investments, debts he couldn't see a way out of. He saw my little operation not as a crime, but as an opportunity." The pieces started clicking into place in Robert's mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. "What kind of opportunity?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "He made me a counteroffer," Paul said. "He and your mom, they wanted out. Out of their lives, out of their debt. They wanted to disappear. He figured if the world thought they were dead, the debt collectors would stop looking. He wanted money. A lot of it. Enough to start over somewhere new, with new names." Robert stared at him, horrified. "You're lying." "I wish I was, kid," Paul said softly. "The deal and that note you found? That was the payoff. I gave them every cent I had saved up. It was cheaper than going to prison. That night at Dock B, I handed your father a duffel bag full of cash. Your mother was with him. They thanked me, turned around, and walked off into the darkness. I never saw them again. They didn't fall into the ocean. They just walked away. The world seemed to tilt under Robert's feet. The story that had defined his life for 9 years, the tragic accident the heroic parents lost to the sea, was a lie. A carefully constructed lie. His parents hadn't been victims. They had been architects of his pain. The grief he had carried for so long curdled into something else, something cold and sharp. The profound agony of betrayal. They hadn't been taken from him. They had left him. Where did they go? Robert asked, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. Paul shook his head. They didn't say for sure. Mentioned going west, maybe California, maybe Oregon, somewhere they could get lost and become new people. Robert stood up, his legs unsteady. The marina, the boats, the setting sun, it all seemed unreal. He looked at Paul, the man he had hunted as a potential monster, and saw only a small-time crook who had been a pawn in his parents' desperate escape plan. There was no grand conspiracy, no villain to punish. There was only the hollow, devastating truth. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Paul sitting at the picnic table. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay there. He got in his car and drove, the questions swirling in his mind. Who were James and Patricia Whitaker? Not the loving parents he had enshrined in his memory. They were strangers, and he was the son they had decided was a price worth paying for a new beginning. Days later, Robert stood in the empty living room of his childhood home. The boxes were all gone, either sent to charity or moved to a storage unit. The rooms echoed with his footsteps. The for sale sign was now planted firmly in the front yard. For 9 years, this house had been a mausoleum, a place of sacred grief. Now he saw it for what it was, the scene of the crime, the starting point of a lie that had stolen a decade of his life. The pain of their abandonment was a fresh, raw wound, far worse than the dull ache of loss he had grown used to. He looked at the photo of them on the mantel, the one he hadn't packed away. He saw their smiles differently now, not as expressions of happiness, but as masks. He wondered if they were still alive out there, living under new names. He wondered if they ever thought of him. Did they regret it? Or was he just a loose end they had successfully tied up? The urge to find them, to confront them, to scream at them, was a fire in his gut. But another part of him knew it was pointless. They weren't his parents anymore. Maybe they never were. Not in the way he thought. He picked up the photo, walked outside to the trash can, and dropped it inside. Selling the house was no longer about moving on from a tragedy. It was about escaping a lie. As he walked back inside for the last time, he knew his search was over, but a new, more difficult journey was just beginning, the journey of learning to live with the truth. Robert was faced with an almost impossible choice: live with the painful knowledge that his parents abandoned him, or spend the rest of his life searching for people who didn't want to be found. What would you have done in his shoes? Would the need for confrontation outweigh the peace of finally letting go? We love hearing your perspectives on these complex situations, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you think, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the mysteries that lie just beneath the surface of everyday life.